Vice-Chancellor, Judge, Pro-Vice-Chancellors, honoured guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the University of London's second 1858 Charter Lecture event. I'm Mary Stiasny, and I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor International of the University of London. And it's my pleasure to be addressing you here tonight at this very special event in the University of London's calendar. The event celebrates the awarding of the university's 1858 Royal Charter by Queen Victoria, which opened up the University of London's degrees for students across the world. However, this year, we're also celebrating another really momentous occasion, which is the opening up of the University of London's special examinations for women in 1868. This was followed 10 years later in 1878 with the University of London, and I like this phrase, permitting women to take the full degrees in the same way as men. In both instances, the University of London was the first to do so in the UK. And following such an impressive history of equality in education, I'm proud to say that today the University of London remains committed to access and equality to deliver quality higher education through distance and flexible learning to over 50,000 students in over 180 countries across the world. This, coupled with the 1.4 million learners we've enrolled on our massive open online courses, also known as MOOCs, delivered through Coursera, has led us to be known as the world's largest classroom. I'm also pleased to say that around 50% of our 50,000 students are women, which is a number we at the University of London are very proud of. However, we accept that there is always room for improvement in this regard. But looking back to 1868, the University of London's introduction of its special examinations for women was an important victory for those campaigning for gender equality at the time. And of the original 9 women who first took those special examinations, as they were called, one of them, Louise Crichton, went on to be a prominent campaigner for women's suffrage. We're therefore immensely proud that the University of London has been at the forefront of women's equality and education in the UK. And this year we are highlighting this work through the university's Leading Women campaign, marking 150 years since the university opened up these examinations for women. And as part of this campaign tonight, we're launching the University of London's worldwide conversation, focusing on women's education and equality in the world of work. And I want to emphasize just how worldwide this conversation will become. Tonight's event sees the launch of a series of international events around the world, each focused on highlighting the different struggles faced by women in higher education and the world of work. As you can see from the map behind me, with those red dots, mark those red dots, we currently have around 20 of these international conversations taking place over the next 2 months in countries ranging from Peru, Trinidad and Tobago, Lebanon, Ghana, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Czech Republic, Russia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And I hope after tonight's conversation, this list will continue to grow in order to put gender parity firmly back on the table across the world. But to return to tonight's event, firstly, we will be hearing from Shauna Olney, who will start the worldwide conversation for us by delivering her keynote lecture. Shauna Olney is Chief of the Gender Equality and Diversity Branch of the International Labour Organization, the ILO, a specialized agency of the United Nations. Shauna Olney has been at the forefront of the international effort to promote women's equality and rights in the world of work for almost 30 years. Her experience as an author, a report leader, and public spokesperson for the ILO affords her a unique perspective on the issues facing women in the world of work and the trajectory they follow in our world today. Following Shauna's keynote lecture, there will be a panel conversation featuring participation from exceptional women leaders from the fields of academia, law, business, and equality campaigning. And we're privileged to have with us tonight the Honourable Mrs. Justice Cheema-Grubb, a judge on the Queen's Bench Division of the High Court of England and Wales. Mrs. Justice Cheema-Grubb has kindly agreed to chair the panel discussion. In 2015, Mrs. Justice Cheema-Grubb broke down professional barriers when she became the first woman of Asian descent to be appointed to the UK High Court. She has since presided over a number of high-profile cases, including the conviction of Darren Osborne, the Finsbury Park terror attacker. The University of London is delighted to have Mrs. Justice Cheema-Grubb participating in this event, and I personally am very pleased to be joining this conversation, which I hope you will all find both useful and interesting. But first, I'd like now to hand over to Shauna Olney and thank her and all our guests for being here with us tonight. Shauna.
Thank you so much for that very warm welcome. Mrs. Justice Cheema-Grubb, Vice-Chancellor, Pro-Vice-Chancellors, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests. It's truly an honor to be giving the keynote lecture tonight to mark the awarding of the university's 1858 Royal Charter, as well as the 150th anniversary of the university opening up examinations to women. There are moments in time that provide us with space for reflection around gender equality. What brings us together today is one of those moments. The decision to allow, as we heard, women to sit the general examinations at the University of London 150 years ago was no doubt a landmark event. The International Labour Organization, where I work, is also celebrating a landmark event. Its establishment through the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The ILO is the oldest organization in the UN family. Coming out of a period of destruction, of turmoil, of profound loss, the establishment of the ILO brought hope and the promise of a better and fairer world for everyone. The first words of the ILO Constitution state that universal and lasting peace can be established only if it is based on social justice. In 1919, the Constitution set out 9 principles of special and urgent importance. One of those was that men and women should receive equal pay for work of equal value, not just for the same work, but for work of equal value. This was not just forward-looking, it was revolutionary. It would be decades before national legislation in any country had the concept of work of equal value. And we still have, across the world, the majority of countries that do not have that concept in their legislation. This was 1919. In 1919, 6 conventions, which are international treaties, were adopted in the ILO, including on hours of work, maternity protection, and night work. While only men sat on the commission that drafted the ILO Constitution, while only men held voting rights in the first conference that adopted those treaties, women prepared their own resolutions. Women participated informally. They participated as advisors. And they made sure that their demands were heard. We had women from France, from the US, women from the British TUC. We had women from Argentina, from India, from many other countries who were there in 1919 advocating for women's rights. And not just for women's rights, for the rights of all workers. They were advocating for protection against night work for everyone. They were advocating for shorter working hours for everyone. While not all their demands were met, in particular on night work, where the prohibition was only for women and for children, the women wanted it for everyone. But they kept fighting for years after, and they made a difference over time. We must acknowledge and celebrate these labor feminists who remained in the shadows, but who profoundly influenced the vision and shape of the International Labour Organization. So what extraordinary moments in time. Today we bring these different celebrations together. The celebration of women in higher education, the celebration of women in the world of work. But these are closely linked. Education is the key that opens the door to employment and to those good jobs that everyone wants. But there are also challenges. And as we look forward, we need to look at those challenges. And I think all of us know that there's still a lot of work to be done. Women's educational achievements have been impressive, and more women than ever are both educated and participating in the labor market. But to what extent are these educational achievements actually translating fully into labor market opportunities? To what extent are educated women getting their fair share of jobs and pay? As the world of work changes at an unprecedented pace, many are concerned about the future of work. And as the ILO reaches its 100th anniversary, this is an important focus of our work. And we need to think carefully about what can be done to ensure a better future of work for women. The future is not preordained. We all have choices to make. So having started with 6 conventions in 1919, almost 100 years later, the ILO has 189 binding conventions. They're on a range of labor and employment issues. All of them are relevant to women, but some deal specifically with equal pay, non-discrimination, workers with family responsibilities. But almost 100 years since the first ILO Convention on Maternity Protection, over 800 million working women still lack maternity leave and benefits. After 100 years, substantive equality in the world of work remains elusive. So the ILO wanted to look at the trends. We wanted to see what was really happening in the world of work. We wanted to look at the progress. Was the progress as good as people were saying? Where were the sticky areas and what could be done? What we found was that progress has stalled, and there are signs that it may in fact be reversing. Despite common assumptions, the gender gaps in the world of work remain stubborn and show no signs of being overcome. Women continue to have fewer jobs than men. They work in a more limited range of jobs. They're paid less, and they have poorer working conditions. So the ILO centenary is an important time to reflect on why progress has been so slow and what can be done to change the trajectory for women. In this spirit, the ILO launched the Women at Work Centenary Initiative, and like this worldwide conversation, we launched a series of Women at Work dialogues. We wanted to examine the experiences around the globe and elicit cutting-edge thinking on innovative and effective approaches. We initiated new research and data, and we examined existing data in different ways. We looked at gender gaps based on key labor market indicators over the past 20 years to see what changes really were being made. We worked with Gallup to find out what women really want in the world of work and why they're not getting it. We examined the gender pay gap in very different ways, and we took a deep dive into issues of care work and care jobs, equal pay, and violence and harassment. And this evening, I'd like to share just some of those findings, as well as some thoughts on the path moving forward. At every stage of our initiative, we were challenging assumptions. And that was something that our Director General said to us at the very beginning. Don't assume we know the answers. So the first thing we wanted to see was how well women were really doing in the world of work. What were the statistics telling us? So we took a snapshot of the past 20 years to see the changes, and we looked both at the quality and the quantity of work. Now, despite common assumptions, we found that very little has changed in terms of closing the gender gaps over the past 20 years, whether they're the employment gap, the job quality gap, the paid and unpaid hours gap, the pay gap, occupational segregation, social protection gap. None of these are moving in any significant way. Let's first look at the employment gender gap. So the difference between men and women who are getting the jobs. Okay, so who's actually getting the jobs and who's not? Now, nearly 1.3 billion women are employed compared to 2 billion men. That in itself is a big gap. But how has that changed over time in terms of the actual number, the percentage between women and men? In 2016, we've been talking about 1986 and 1989, now we're talking about 2016. We'll come back to more or less the present. When we did our analysis, we were very surprised to find that the employment gender gap had closed by only 0.6% in 20 years. So not even 1%. At the time, I remember speaking at a number of events and saying, we should be really, really concerned about this. And we need to do something fundamentally different. Our newest figures, however, are even more worrying. They show that the global employment gap since 1999 has now closed by only 0.1%. So in other words, it appears to be rolling back. Women living with children up to the age of 5 have the lowest employment rates, whereas fathers of younger children have the highest rates. Perhaps that doesn't surprise us, but there's clearly a motherhood employment penalty and a fatherhood employment premium. This parenthood employment gap is approximately 40% globally, and the UK figures match that. However, what's clear is that education matters in employment. The employment gap is closing more rapidly between men and women with university degrees. Globally, the gender employment gap is 41% for those with only primary level education, slightly lower at secondary, and 25% at the university level. In Europe and Central Asia, the employment gender gap for those with university degrees is the lowest at 5%. So education matters. So we've looked at the employment gap. Now let's look at another really worrying trend, and that's the gender pay gap. Women still earn less than men, and the gender pay gap globally is approximately 20%. But there's a further pay gap beyond the initial pay gap between women and men, and that's between mothers and non-mothers. So there's a motherhood pay gap between women. And there's a pay gap between mothers and fathers. Fathers, just as they get an employment premium, get a pay premium. There's also a gender gap in the paid and unpaid hours worked. So we talk about men working long hours. Well, in fact, women may work shorter hours for pay, but they work longer hours per day if you put paid and unpaid work together. Women perform over 75% of the total hours of unpaid care work. In the UK, this is 64%. Time poverty is a reality for most women, and this severely impacts on their ability to take up paid formal work. While women represent 40% of total employment, they make up 57% of those working shorter hours and part-time. Another common assumption is that women are increasingly entering male-dominated fields. Globally, this is not actually happening. In all parts of the world, women remain overrepresented in the lowest paid occupations, concentrated in services, particularly health, education, and the retail trade sector. Women continue to have access to a much narrower range of jobs than men. Occupational segregation has not decreased in the last 20 years. It has, in fact, increased. So what about this cumulative disadvantage that women face throughout their working lives? Lower levels of employment, lower wages, lower access to labor-based social protection. It means that in old age, more women than men are living in poverty. So whatever progress there has been, it's limited, and it has been far too slow. Let me go back to talk about the gender pay gap and unequal pay. When we talk about valuing work, one of the most visible ways to do that is around pay. So my work is worth this many pounds, this many dollars. The raw wage gap tells only part of the story. I often hear people tell me that, the wage gap isn't really that useful because it can be explained away. It's a difference in education. It's a difference in the sector. It's a difference in experience. So really, there's not a significant discrimination gap. Women are not being discriminated in pay. Well, we tried to examine the pay gap in ways that help to check and challenge these assumptions and to try to support policy responses. So let's look at education. Education, as we know, clearly matters in terms of better pay. But what about the gender pay gap? On average in Europe, those with bachelor's degrees earn 42% more than those with secondary education. And those with a master's or doctorate earn on average 75 to 80% more than those with secondary education. Okay, so education makes a difference for both women and men in terms of pay. But we find gender pay gaps at all levels of education. In the UK, the gender pay gap is highest at 26% for those with upper secondary education. Okay, 26% for those with upper secondary education. Now, we'd expect that that pay gap would decrease as we went up the education level, but it doesn't. The gap for those with tertiary education is almost the same as it is for those with education below upper secondary, 22 and 21% respectively. That should worry us. So education does not seem to make a difference in reducing the gender pay gap. Now let's look at the explained and the unexplained portions of the wage gap. Let's go back to this issue of the element of discrimination. What can't we explain away by education, experience, sector, and various other variables? If we adjust for experience, education, occupational category, economic activity, location, and hours worked, very tangible issues, there still remains a sizable unexplained portion. And this doesn't decrease as you go up the pay scale. It actually increases, this unexplained part. In other words, contrary to what is often assumed, the more you make, the more likely you are to be subject to pay discrimination. In some countries, when we examine the explained portion of the pay gap, notably education, it indicates that women should actually be earning more than men, not less. Women with higher education than men are being paid less in a number of countries. Again, this should worry us. Now, we often hear that women make choices about work and family, that a lot of this, in terms of women not going into the world of work, not getting into those high-paid jobs, it's a question of choice. We also hear that women can't have it all. Of course, we don't hear that men can't have it all. So I wonder about that sometimes. So we decided, again, it was time to stop making assumptions and to ask women, what do you want in the world of work? Do you prefer to be working at a paid job? And if you do, what's happening to stop you? So we partnered with Gallup. We added 5 new questions to Gallup's world poll, and we asked women and men in 142 countries and territories the same questions. Okay. Gallup has the largest globally comparable data set in the world, so with our 5 questions, we were actually able to cross it with a lot of other Gallup data, which was extremely helpful. Our findings certainly help change the discourse. I often hear people say, women don't want to work, you don't understand, they would prefer to stay home. Well, that's not what our study told us. The majority of women worldwide would prefer to be working at paid jobs. And interestingly, when we asked men what they thought women preferred, they agreed that women should be working. So men and women are agreeing that women should be working, that's a good thing, that's a preference. Regardless of women's present employment status, they want to work, including those out of the workforce. Even those beyond national retirement ages want to work at paid jobs. And education, again, has an impact. it impacts preferences. More highly educated women are more likely to prefer to work at paid jobs. Globally, those with university education, we find 83% would prefer to work at paid jobs, whereas with primary education, it's only 60%. In the UK, the gap is slightly smaller. 86% of those with university education would prefer to be in paid jobs, whereas 71% with primary education would prefer to be in paid jobs. So it's slightly less. It's a 15% gap rather than a 23% gap globally. So women prefer to be in paid work. But we also hear this is for lots of reasons. They may be forced, they may feel that they have to survive, that really they don't want to, but preference is about survival in some cases, and that may in fact be true. But another recent Gallup study looks at how women and men rate their lives and how this relates to full-time jobs. So Gallup classifies people as thriving, struggling, or suffering according to how they rate their lives. Now, interestingly, women, more than men, are more likely to consider themselves thriving when they're working full-time for an employer. And this is whether or not they have children. We also asked in the ILO Gallup survey about the acceptability in the family for women to have paid jobs outside the home if they want one. So we asked both women and men about acceptability. 83% of women and 77% of men said it was perfectly acceptable for the women in their families to have paid jobs outside their home. Again, education counts in terms of acceptability. Globally, university education increases the acceptability for women to work by about 10% between primary and university. However, in the UK, the level of education doesn't have a significant impact, since acceptability is already at 98%. It's one of the highest. If women want to work at paid jobs, we know they do. If it's overall acceptable at the household level, and we know it is, and if it makes them happier, they're thriving when they're in full-time jobs, what is the obstacle? So we asked the question, what is the main challenge? And it was an open-ended question. Perhaps not surprisingly, work-family balance or access to affordable care, those two issues, came up as either the first or second challenge in every single region. And of course, they're closely related. Again, there are differences based on education level. Women with university education are more likely to point to work-family balance and unequal pay as the top challenges. Remember, we saw that the higher you are on the pay scale, the higher the wage discrimination is likely to be. So women with university education are seeing that. In the UK, unequal pay was first, but it was matched by care and work-family if you put those together. There remains an unacceptable gap between women's aspirations and the labor market reality. So how can that trajectory be altered? The ILO Gallup report gave us some new insights that we've built on. Now, despite progress in education, despite laws, policies, and programs, despite a large number of international commitments, the world has fallen short in bringing jobs, both in terms of quality and quantity, to women in line with those of men. It's time to change the narrative and truly transform the world of work and society. But transformation will not come about by tentative incremental changes or by characterizing gender equality as a women's issue. Transformation will not come about if measures for a better future of women at work are limited to fixing the women. Well, if only more women went into STEM, if only women took their jobs seriously, if only women were really ambitious. So let's go to STEM. We often hear that it's about having more girls and women enroll in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or moving into male-dominated occupations. But we need to challenge this approach. It's part of the answer, but it misses fundamental pieces of the puzzle. We need policies and measures that fundamentally challenge the way we think about gender roles and responsibilities. Much of the assumptions that we make about responsibilities and roles are around women's and men's roles regarding care. And a lot of the problems, a lot of the issues really stem from that. So the ILO has done extensive research on the relationship between paid and unpaid care work, as well as between unpaid care work and other jobs. So the pervasive assumption in all societies that childcare and other care responsibilities should be the main responsibility of women, both at home and in work, has major implications. First, I mentioned earlier, time poverty. Care responsibilities, in particular childcare, and more also elder care, is a major obstacle to women accessing and progressing in work. Women and girls are performing more than 3/4 of the total amount of unpaid care work. While men's contribution in some countries has increased, even in those countries, it would take 210 years to close the unpaid care gap. In 2018, 600 million women, compared to 40 million men, are either unavailable for employment or not seeking a job due to unpaid care responsibilities. 600 million women. 16.4 billion hours, yes, billion, 16.4 billion hours are spent in care work every day. This is equivalent to 2 billion people working 8 hours per day for free, and most of those people are women. The other major implication of the assumption that women should be responsible for all care responsibilities is the undervaluation of paid care jobs. 2/3 of all care workers globally are women. These are often low quality, low paid, and undervalued jobs. It's seen as an extension of women's natural function at home. So why should we pay them much? They use only soft skills. We don't pay soft skills high wages, do we? And I have to say soft skills is a phrase that particularly bothers me, because I think it's used to undervalue the work that women do. The narrative that encourages women to move into STEM, for example, reinforces the value attributed to male-dominated occupations over those dominated by women. Men are not encouraged, for example, to move into traditionally female jobs, such as nursing. Low market value becomes the touchstone for actual value, rather than reviewing the biased assessments. We also know that women who do get technology degrees in Europe drop out of the technology industry at an alarming rate. So STEM is not the answer, or it's not the full answer. The future of work needs to resolve the tension between care and work, and we're far from getting there. If the disadvantage that attaches to gender is to be redressed and stigma and stereotyping overcome in the world of work, care issues must be addressed. To achieve structural change where differences are accommodated and valued, gender relations need to be reconstructed so that women can enter the paid workforce on equal terms, and men can also take on caring roles. That's the other piece of the puzzle that's often missed. Men are missing out due to stereotypes and to pressure to work very long hours in paid employment. So no matter how many women study STEM, how many women are mentored, have role models, are given targeted opportunities for advancement, if they cannot balance their role as mothers, daughters of aging parents, and work outside the home, history will repeat itself. Now, I'd like to focus in on care jobs. Our research has looked at unpaid care and care jobs together. Often research looks at them separately, but we've really tried to see the linkages. When we look at care jobs in our study, we include health and social work, education, and domestic workers. Care workers represent 11.5% of global employment and almost 20% of global female employment. Most care workers are employed in education. Ensuring good jobs in education is essential for development. The research is there. High levels of employment in the education sector is positively correlated with economic development. On the other hand, poverty rates are highly correlated with low levels of employment in education. Education is, as we know, highly feminized. In Europe, the sector represents almost 13% of women's employment, compared to less than 4% of men's. Our research shows that the pay and conditions of those in the education sector is directly related to the quality of education. In other words, if you want good quality of education, you have to have good terms and conditions of employment. In most OECD countries, teachers' salaries increase with the level of education they teach. But the economic downturn in 2008 has had a direct impact on teachers' salaries, and salaries in a number of countries have decreased in real terms, including the UK. And there has been an increase in temporary and part-time staff. And among academic staff, there are clear gender inequalities in terms of who is accessing those more stable permanent positions. And this is being exacerbated. The ILO is advocating a high road to care work based on extensive research and analysis. A high road to care would support gender equality, development, and generate new jobs. There are not enough jobs to go around, and in the future that is likely to be worse. And the care economy could be a major area of employment growth. Our research shows clearly that policy matters in determining the level of employment, working conditions, and pay and status of care workers. Public provision of care services tends to improve the working conditions and pay of care workers, whereas unregulated private provision tends to worsen them. Care policies are essential. Across the world, the demand for care professions is already high, but will increase. The projected care gaps are enormous. With an increasingly aging population in many countries and a growing youthful populations in many others, the demand for care will grow. The demographics are absolutely clear. If not addressed properly, current deficits in care work and its quality will create a severe global care crisis. The ILO estimates that if investment in care services does not increase by at least 6% of global GDP by 2030, deficits in coverage will increase and working conditions of care workers will continue to deteriorate. A high road scenario to care requires doubling current levels of investment in education, health, and social work by 2030. The high road scenario is projected to result in millions of new jobs and revenue. We need to recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care work, reward paid care workers by promoting decent and more jobs for care workers, including in education, and guarantee care workers representation and social dialogue, including collective bargaining. So in concluding, I want to go back to the landmark events that have brought us together tonight. 150 years ago, women finally being accepted into higher education. 100 years ago, a commitment to social justice and equality in the world of work. I try to imagine what it must have been like to be part of that moment, to imagine the expectations and the hope among women, the world of promise and possibilities that both these events opened up. Tonight, I want each of us to think about in our own spheres of influence, how we can ensure that the hopes and expectations were not in vain, to fulfill the promise of those first women admitted to the University of London and those labor feminists in 1919. A future which intentionally and boldly embraces gender equality will be a better future for women, for men, and our societies. This must include an investment in education. Higher education will be central to ensuring a better future for women at work. But education is also under pressure. We read about the massification of tertiary education, and that's a real term used in the literature. With the number of students more than doubling in the past 20 years, which is far outpacing the increase in academic staff. We hear about funding cuts, the erosion of wages and working conditions. In order to have a better future of work for women, we need an ecosystem of initiatives. One-off measures will not work. We cannot ignore the interaction between gendered roles in the home, in education, in the workforce, and in public life. We must push on many fronts to ensure that women have equal opportunities to education, to good jobs, to ensure that what they do is valued in every sphere, and that the world of work is safe and fair for all. And as we move forward, we can all be inspired by those pioneering women at the University of London and the labor feminists who helped shape the ILO. Thank you very much. Thank you. And before we move to the panel, I have the honor to give the floor to Madam Justice Cheema-Grubb. Please, the floor is yours.
Come and join us. I think you're there, Shauna. Good. Well, welcome. Wasn't that a fantastic and inspiring talk that worked you up a little bit? Do you feel a little bit worked up? Yes, I hope so. It's extraordinary to think that after over 100 years of these initiatives, we're in the position that we're in. But a conversation like this is a unique opportunity, isn't it? We have this moment in time, all of us, together, and these 20 other conversations that are going to happen throughout the world after this one has set the whole thing in motion. It is a moment for us to stop and think and see how we can move on, how we can move forward. In Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte puts into the mouth of the protagonist these words: "Women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer." And I think often on the topics that Shauna's been raising, there's an awful lot of noise that we hear. The opportunity for a conversation is something altogether more civilized. And we have here, I'm surrounded by these splendid women that we're going to have the opportunity to listen to. And I'm delighted to see prominent women both on this stage and also in the audience, and also prominent men, because you are just as important. As a judge, you may know that we are prohibited from expressing views on matters of public policy in public. We have to be impartial in public life, and that's to preserve our independence and impartiality in our daily work, where we have to command the confidence of all of those that appear in front of us. So I'm perhaps in a good position to be able to facilitate this conversation and to draw out from our contributors here, I hope some words, I'm sure, some words of wisdom and some more inspiration to us. Now, Shauna Olney has set us off very well, I think, and made us all think and be somewhat shocked, I hope so. So I relish this opportunity and I welcome you all to the conversation. So we're fundamentally concerned with two questions, and let me set them out for you. And at the end of our discussion, I'll try and draw together where we've got to from all our contributions. You have them in your programs, but first of all, given that women have been shown to be as professionally ambitious as men, and given that there is a rapidly growing percentage of women gaining degrees and higher education qualifications, why then are we still not seeing the same representative sample of women in leadership roles around the world? And the second question is, what is a modern university's utopian responsibility not just utopian, I think, but in the real world too, pragmatic responsibility with regards to gender equality, and how, through a fulfillment of this responsibility, can a modern university's focus on gender equality become impactful within wider society. So in the panel this evening, we have the following women who are all leaders in their fields. First of all, you have Shauna, who you've already met and heard from. We're very delighted to have her, and she's already been introduced to you. We also have, next to her, Kuljit Bhogal. Now, the thing about Kuljit is that she is a lawyer, and we lawyers like to hear from each other. It's quite important, actually, to listen to lawyers, because lawyers are on the cutting edge of a lot of these issues, as some people in the audience know. And often law is the way through, because if the law sets a standard and then people have to work to it because it's the law and there are consequences if the law is not followed, and that can help to move all of us on. Sam Smethers, just rejoining us. Welcome, Sam. She's Chief Executive of the Fawcett Society, at the forefront of many of these issues, and I'm sure she'll have really interesting things to contribute to us. Francesca Lagerberg is next to me on my right. She's global leader of network capabilities at Grant Thornton International. So a really high-powered woman who can speak to us about why we're not seeing more women in positions like hers. On my left, we have, you all know her, Dr. Mary Stiasny, Pro Vice-Chancellor International of the University of London, at the very heart of these celebrations and of our future looking forward. Stella Dadzie is next to her. I've just met Stella. I've already been massively impressed by her. She's a writer and a historian, best known for her co-authorship of the groundbreaking book, The Heart of the Race, Black Women's Lives in Britain. And then we have Professor Isabel Fernandez-Mateo, the Adecco Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at London Business School, and lots of important work being done at London Business School, which she'll be able to tell us about. So let's start, because it's a conversation, not just you hearing from me. I'm going to start with Dr. Stiasny. Now, at this moment in time, with the opportunities that we have and the celebrations that we're all part of, listening to what Shauna Olney's been saying, do you think London University is really equipped to meet these challenges?
I think the challenges are huge. The challenges are enormous. I think across the world we all share some of the difficulties and the concerns about ways forward. Certainly at the University of London, what we're doing is trying to confront these challenges and trying to look together at how we might move forward and actually develop ways of supporting women and supporting men as well, to make steps in terms of equality together.
And where do you think the biggest challenges come in that effort?
I think there are huge challenges in terms of possibly some very strong cultural impediments that sit for women and for women moving forward. I think there are very strong hidden cultural signifiers like, for example, unconscious bias. I think there are very strong issues for women about how they might move their own work position forward. And then I think there are outside, and I think for all of us this applies, there are very powerful social forces which inhibit women's ability to take some of the opportunities that they can take. That's for starters. There's a lot more to talk about.
Now, we all know in this country about the massive increase in university availability. and the large proportionate increase in the number of young people going to university. And she introduced this phrase, which I hadn't heard before, the massification of higher education. What is the challenge of that in this area? Because it has to be met with an equivalent proportionate increase in resources and infrastructure. Is that happening in your experience?
I think you're absolutely right, and Shauna raises these issues. I think for us, one might say that higher education is in crisis. There are concerns around resourcing, there are concerns around availability. But what I am absolutely convinced about is that for us, for all women, and for indeed men as well, the right for women to have higher education, the right for women to have university education in this country was very hard won. And what we must do is ensure that that is not lost and it's not in any way eroded. So we have to work together to move that forward. And I think it is possibly by working together and by unifying behind and uniting behind some of these issues that we can actually keep things at the forefront and move things forward and not lose ground. Because I think my concern is that we can lose ground.
All right. Thank you. Francesca, can I ask you to come in now? Policies and measures that fundamentally change the way that we think about gender roles and responsibilities and challenging assumptions are some of the things that Shauna began to speak about. What's your reaction to that? And what do you think are the key assumptions that we need to challenge more?
I think it's really compelling to look at the business world today because a lot of education is ultimately leading to how can people work or where do they fit into society. So if you look at the business world and you look at where women are placed at the moment, I think there's some really compelling evidence that we could do so much better. From a pure commercial point of view, what you see there is a lot of potential being wasted or lost or never fully taken to where it could go. So we do a survey each year at Grant Thornton. We look around the globe. We take soundings from not just the big organizations, but the powerhouse of most economies, that small and middle-sized types of business. And if you look over the last 15 years that we've been doing this, nothing has really changed. The number of women in positions hasn't really altered. So you may open the door of a boardroom and you'll see a woman. You'll probably see a woman on most boards, but you're not actually seeing the proportion of women increase. So there's a really good, there's both an opportunity and a challenge there. A challenge about why hasn't it changed, but also an opportunity for people to go, well, if the world is moving, we have huge disruption taking place, there is a massive opportunity to use this to ensure that we are utilizing the skills that we have more effectively.
Now, Shauna spoke about stagnation and stalling in progress, and you've just said the same thing. So what are the fundamental underlying assumptions that have led to that position? So one woman in each boardroom. So we have our woman.
Yes, we tick the box. There is a little bit of a plateauing, and a lot of those women who are in that boardroom, which I appreciate is just one part of a business, often are the non-executive director. They're not the operational person. So does that mean that everyone's gone, oh, it's about time we got a woman on the board, let's get somebody in? Or is actually there a fundamental shift, a behavioural change taking place in business? There's been some fascinating research based on a whole range of different assumptions, but also really spearheaded by higher education establishments looking at this, who've gone, businesses that are successful often outperform the market where they have a more diverse leadership team. And that's diversity, not just about gender, but in all forms of thinking, because you move away from groupthink, you start challenging yourself internally. So I think in answer to your question around the assumptions that underpin it, is that the existing model doesn't have to be the model for tomorrow. And if we are really going to move into a new world, our fourth industrial revolution, we don't have to do things the same. And in fact, we probably can't.
All right, so you think there's an imperative there, there's necessary change?
I think there is necessary change. I also think it's a fantastic opportunity, because if you can leapfrog where we are today to go to a better place, a lot of the things that we'll be talking about today, disruption, new technology, robotics, artificial intelligence, innovation, whatever it might be, actually is a springboard for actually using people more effectively, giving them more opportunities. And that could be around agility, around empathy, around how you marry humanity with artificial intelligence. Actually, all those skills are absolutely the heart of what women often bring to a workplace.
So, in fact, there's a bit of an echo from what you've just said. And Shauna was talking about soft skills, a phrase she doesn't like because it can undermine or demean what women traditionally can bring, perhaps, in the eyes of business leaders. But you're saying, actually, those may be the skills that are necessary to make sense of AI and robotic
There's
work.
nothing soft about life skills. There's something emotional intelligence, the ability to bring a wider view. There's nothing, if you equate soft with weak, there's nothing soft about any of those. They're often the hardest things to do.
Absolutely. All right, well, I can see lots of women agreeing with you, and men as well. All right, Sam, Fawcett Society, okay, at the forefront of many of these things. I mean, you'll be able to tell us, won't you, about some of the assumptions that need to be challenged and are being challenged all the time. What do you think is the approach that we need to change in terms of assumptions, particularly in business, from where you sit and what you see?
Well, I think Shauna's speech, really presented some of them already. But I think one of the big challenges we've got are sort of structural barriers. The way we design work, the sort of fundamentals of the way we design work haven't shifted for decades, and so it's essentially still a male model of work, to put it in a sort of colloquialism, really. But it's not designed around women's lives. It's not designed with flexibility in mind. And yet we're not getting the best out of people. We always talk about the gender pay gap as a productivity gap. And we think the reason why the UK government, at least, has been taking some action on that with gender pay gap reporting is because they recognise, actually, the productivity cost, where you've got this highest, best educated female labour force, but you're not translating that into pay and promotion and progression in the workplace. So we've got a massive problem with wastage in our economy, with women's skills and training. And so one of I think the big barriers is the way we design it. And I think the other big barrier is the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about what's a woman's job, what's a man's job. We're one of the biggest, most heavily segregated economies in the world, in the UK. If you look at the way we design part-time work and the way that's heavily dominated by women, look at the way we talked about the STEM industries, but look at 83% of our care workforce or social care workforce are women. And only a fraction of engineering and technology graduates are women. So we really aren't getting the best out of our educated women, but we're also driving that by the assumptions we make about what's appropriate for women and men to do. And that goes back to the way we stereotype in the early years. And really we need to unravel all of that if we're really going to drive that change. So we've got some big things to tackle.
I was quite struck by Shauna's quoting the statistic of the number of women who felt they were thriving if they were in paid work for an employer. And that it was the same whether they had children or didn't have children. But what's your reaction to that?
I think it's about independence and financial independence for women. That's one of the fundamentals. And if you're dependent on a man, then you haven't got choices in your life. And we know that dependency is one of the big challenges for women, breaking out of that. So being in paid work is one way out of that, although we know this structural low paid work for so many women doesn't translate into that, unfortunately. But I think also it's about that fulfilling yourself, fulfilling your potential in the labour market, and just dignity that comes with being in paid work. So all of those things, and we've been spending a lot of time this year talking about 100 years of women's votes and looking back over that period. But a lot of the fight for the vote was also alongside the fight for access to higher education, the fight to get women into the labour market, and then the fight for equal pay. So all of these went hand in hand. And so it's about those sort of fundamental human rights that women need to fulfil just as much as men.
All right. Thank you, Sam. Now, Professor Fernandez, I want to ask you a question about your work. You've looked, haven't you, at how women are underrepresented at the top levels in business, particularly in leadership of organisations. Is that all to do with perception, male structures, low expectations? What have you found is the reason?
It's obviously a very complex phenomenon, and there are many reasons. It's a combination of choices, women's choices, and organizational cultures, of course. So I'd like to use a little bit of the research I've done to touch upon some of the things that Shauna had already mentioned, because I do hear a lot from my students, from people in business, in the press, that if women are not there at the top of the organization because of boards or in chief executive positions, things like that, it's partly because women are risk averse, maybe they're not ambitious, maybe they don't like competition. So this is told over and over again, it's part of the rhetoric. And there is some truth to the fact that women are less likely to apply for these positions. I've actually found that in my research. The question, of course, is why, right? Because when we see that women are less likely to apply, then we immediately draw the conclusion that the solution is to tell women to be more ambitious. Just tell women to sit at the table, to lean in, if you wish, right? Obviously, that's the straightforward solution, but it makes a very strong assumption, and the assumption is that that table that you're going to sit in is the same for you and for everybody else. It's the same for men and for women. And very often, that's actually not the case. So let me tell you a very little personal story, if I may. Do I have the time?
Of course.
It's just a very silly story that we can all relate. I went to give a talk a couple months ago with an audience, a very big audience, around 400 people. And I get there, and obviously we have to get our microphones, and the technician couldn't fit the microphone because I was wearing a dress. And of course, nobody had thought that the speaker would be wearing a dress because every other speaker were men. You put them in a suit, right? So it was challenging. And we all experienced that because we just experienced it in the back of the room as well. And this is a very silly story. But I think it highlights one of the most important questions that people ask themselves when they are trying to decide whether they want to compete for those jobs, which is simply, do people like me belong here? And then really the answer to this question I found in my research is extremely important to understand why sometimes we do see women dropping out, we see women choosing not to compete for these positions. Very recently, I did a study of around 10,000 executives in the UK, in which I saw that women were much less likely than men to compete for a top management job if they had been rejected for a similar job in the past. So rejection mattered. And why is this important? Well, it is very important because if you think about it, in order to get to the top, it's a constant set of rejections over your career. You compete, you get rejected, you try again, you have to try again. If you don't try, then this is going to have consequences in the long run. And when we actually went and see why was this happening, this was not because women were risk averse. This was not because they just didn't have an innate preference to compete. In the interviews, they would tell us things that had to do with the way that these recruitment processes were managed. So for example, I was talking to the CFO of a biotech company who had been considered for a CEO job in another biotech company, and I've heard the stories like this all over, again and again, in which she would say, well, you know, I was applying for this job, the process took months, eventually I did not get the job. And she was not bothered about not getting the job, but she got the distinct impression that the only reason why she had been considered is because she was a woman, and they needed a woman in the shortlist. And obviously, that made her think that I'm not going to put myself again for a position like this anymore. And over, this question of do I belong here, even for these very highly qualified, highly powerful women, kept coming in, because when you come to the room and you've been an outsider and a minority for a very long time, the experiences that you bring in make the room very different. So the men have not experienced this for the most part. Of course, we'll start talking about other types of minority status, then the issue gets very complicated. But if we just focus on men and women, most of the men, particularly white male, have never been experienced to be negatively stereotyped, which means they didn't care much about the rejection because it was not a sign that they did not belong. Therefore, it didn't affect their future choices. So, you know, at the end of the day, when you start thinking about this, what are the consequences for organizations? It comes back to the idea of if we just assume that for women to lean in, you have to encourage them, it's an assumption that it's about fixing the women. But it doesn't really solve the underlying problem, which is that problem of belonging. And what can organizations do to send the signal, and organizations and universities and society in general, that everybody is valued and everybody is welcome to compete. So that's a very long-winded answer. I just want to give you a sense of the research that you've done on this, because I do think that this has very important implications for the solutions that we implement in our organization.
Well, we've heard about the structure of work being very male, and now you've talked about the structure of recruitment being male. So those are two quite fundamental and quite important and interesting topics, aren't they?
Yeah.
Have you got any insight into how the structure of recruitment could be changed so that women didn't have that sense, well, they had to have somebody who was on the shortlist who was female, or they had to show they were making an effort, but it wasn't a real effort?
Right. So one of the things that we have found is that very often at top management positions, the problem is that women are not even applying for the jobs. And, but if you do actually go out and convince them to apply, they actually will get the job eventually, right? So that is so acting on who it is that you are bringing in. That's a very important one. Providing feedback, like clear feedback. We were having some conversations before about why you may or may not have got the job, and the feedback has to be actionable, and not personal. So one of the problems that we see a lot in recruitment processes, but also in organizations in general performance evaluations, is that women, when they are given feedback about how they're doing, the feedback is much more personal. So it has to do with their attitude, with their personality, even with their looks, and all these sort of things that, of course they feel personal, because they are personal, as opposed to the feedback that men receive, on average, tends to be about, you need to build these skills, you need to go into that market, so they're very actionable things. So the combination of receiving feedback, which is vague, so it's not very actionable, and personal, it's a problem both in recruitment processes, but also within organizations. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but there's a lot of evidence that the kind of feedback that we give, and how transparent we are about the selection process, does make a huge difference.
Can I just jump in there?
Of course you can, Shauna.
I think this issue of feedback is so important, and I think it's something that also happens in higher education in terms of tutorials. This is something we hear about, where the young men will be told what they're doing well with their essays, how they're moving forward, what they should be doing better. It's very technical about the work, whereas the women are told that they have great personalities, they really enjoy having these tutorials with them. It's such a pleasure. And if you start comparing those, you're getting very different feedback. So that's starting at the education level as well, and possibly at the household level. So.
Okay, well that's really interesting. That's really helpful as a sort of starter to pointing the way to some of the solutions to the topics we're identifying. Stella, can I bring you in now as well, please? Clearly, we have got a long way to go before we can say that there's fair representation at appropriate levels of work for women. Do you think that institutional discrimination against women, perhaps identified in the sort of structural things that we've been hearing about already, will ever be a thing of the past? This is the utopian idea that someone's introduced.
I'd like to think it would be eventually. My fear is that it's going to take a lot longer than we imagine, and I think there's a danger, just listening to the conversation we've had thus far, in talking about women as if they're a homogenous group. Yeah. The reality is that black women face all the obstacles we've been discussing, and some, and you've only got to look at recent data from your own, what used to be quality unit, it's called something else now, isn't it? Advanced HE or something. Data very recently that showed that of 19,000 university professors, 25 identify as black women. That is an appalling statistic in 2018. And I think there's a real problem about just talking about women self-deselecting from these jobs or feeling too intimidated to apply and the kinds of things we've been talking about. The reality is there's such a thing as institutional racism and institutional sexism. And although I've been billed here as a writer and historian, the reality is that I spent much of my career trudging into institutions, both at higher and further education level and schools, and trying to challenge the lack of political will to make any real meaningful change. I think that statistic speaks volumes, and I don't think that we can afford to be smug sitting here today about where women have reached, because my measure of women's equality has to start with where black women are. If we move into the realm of students, you've got similar, really questionable statistics about student achievement. And as we're busy, you're talking about massification, we used to call it widening participation. But the reality is that now that students bring in 27 grand a year, there's, I believe, I may be wrong.
Over a degree, you mean? So
Sorry.
9,000 a year and 27
27 over a degree, I beg your pardon. But now they bring in that level of income. There's perhaps more emphasis on quantity rather than quality. So what you see is still a huge gap of 15, I think it was 15, possibly 13% in terms of black and minority ethnic student achievement compared to white students. Now, when you look at what's happening at school level, that is not the same. Black and minority ethnic children achieve better at primary level than their counterparts. So something is happening. And I refuse to accept that all these problems are problems that we need to resolve within ourselves. I think we have to look outward, we have to look at the context, we have to look at the society at large. I know from my own experience as a black woman in this world that people's perceptions and stereotypes of who I am have been a huge hurdle. I also know that when I talk to senior managers about their recruitment practices, that one of the serious, the most huge obstacles that we face is cloning, the tendency to look for someone who looks like you. So those of us who come as newcomers, whether we're just new as women or new as black faces, face that additional hurdle. We don't fit in. We don't look as if we're going to fit the part. So I can recount countless examples from my own experience, walking into institutions like this and being asked, have you come for the access course interviews? Going to international events as a keynote speaker, and my male colleagues being asked, have they brought their bed warmer? You know, countless examples which are too numerous to mention, which show that I think, you know, we need to guard against being smug. As I said earlier, we have a long way to go. And that is not to discount the progress we've made. Of course, in the last 150 years, we're here at least. But there's a way to go, and I would like to see a lot more focus in our discussion as well on how we tackle institutional inequalities, and less focus on what the problem is in terms of women. I'm reminded of a poem by Langston Hughes. Some of you may know it, and it goes something like, by what sends the white folks, I ain't sent, I know I can't be president. Now, I think that speaks volumes in terms of how people perceive themselves. Perhaps post-Obama and Michelle, we should be thinking differently. But if I don't see me or people who look like me in those positions, then the reality is that I'm going to think, not so much, can I do that job, but am I going to be lonely? And am I going to be isolated? Am I going to be invisible? Those are the questions, I think, that black women encounter and women of colour encounter. And that is not our problem, that's the problem of the institution.
Okay, so I get that. And again, it's another structure thing, isn't it? You're calling it institutional, but it's still about the structure and assumptions and expectations. In trying to move on, what do you think is a way of tackling it which is fresh? I mean, it's obviously it's necessary for people like you, like me, to go into organisations and institutions and just be there and be seen. That's important. But apart from that, apart from just being there where perhaps you weren't before, what else can the institutions do, particularly in the context of education?
I don't have any easy answers. I wish I did. I'd be a very rich woman if I did. But I do think that institutions have to have an honest conversation with themselves. I do believe they need to listen to their students. I did choose this T-shirt, incidentally, very mindfully. I do think it is about empowerment, and we all have a role in that, whether we are the chief exec or the chancellor of an organisation, or indeed somebody more lowly. I am quite heartened by some of the actions that students themselves have taken to draw attention to inequalities. I'm reminded of Lola Olufemi at Cambridge last year, who was targeted, I think, for challenging the Eurocentrism in the curriculum. But nevertheless, it is heartening to think that students can draw attention to issues like this. And having worked in schools for many years, I know that what we are taught in the curriculum does actually impact not just on our attraction to it, but our achievement at the end of a degree course. So there's a whole range of areas where we need to make an impact, from the curriculum that's taught to the way we recruit and seek people to replace those who are leaving, and to how we support students through the education process. And I believe that there is a huge discrepancy between home students and overseas students, many of whom, of course, will be black and minority ethnic. So they too must be a litmus test of how effective we are in making our institutions accessible and places that will actually lead to proper achievement.
That's really helpful, thank you. Stella, now, Kuljit, I'm going to bring you in. You represented one side in an important case recently, the successful side, so well done. Do you want to just tell us in a few sentences what the issues were in that case?
Sure. So I was involved in defending a challenge to something called a Public Spaces Protection Order that Ealing had put in place. And they put it in place because they got an abortion clinic in their area. And what was happening outside that clinic was, for the last 23 years, they've had what the participants of the activity call prayer vigils. Some of us might call them protests. And what was happening at an increasing frequency is that daily there'd be 2 or more people standing outside this clinic in line of sight of the door, very often at the gate, interacting, engaging with the service users. So they'd stop them on their way into the clinic, and they'd stop them on their way out of the clinic. And they would say things like, their perspective was that they were offering support and an alternative to abortion, and that was information that was available to them. What the service users were reporting is that they found their behaviour, the obstruction of entrance, the things that were being said, the offering of rosary beads, being told that they were murderers, having to see bloody pictures of aborted fetuses, having to walk past baby dolls, plastic dolls of fetuses at various stages of gestation. What was being reported was that they found that intimidating and disturbing, and that in many instances, what the clinic was reporting is that on the days when the protests were outside, service users would see the protest and would phone up to cancel their appointments, or they'd phone them to ask to be escorted into the premises. So there was this harassment, intimidation going on, and Ealing acted. And the action they took was to put in place a Public Spaces Protection Order, or a PSPO, which created a safe zone. And that safe zone is along most of the length of the street that this clinic is on, and it provides a safe area of access. And it also, in order to promote the free speech of those participating in the protests, provided a designated area where they could stand to continue to voice their views. The particularly objectionable thing about what was going on is that it was at the point of access to what is medical treatment. And very often it was after a procedure. And there were instances of mums or people that had just had abortions being told that they were murderers, or that someone would go to shake their hand and place a plastic model of a fetus in their hand when that woman had just had an abortion. So there was some really objectionable behaviour occurring. Two of the participants in these prayer vigils brought a High Court challenge, and there's a process by which these orders can be challenged within the first 6 weeks after they're made. And that challenge was heard by the High Court earlier this year and dismissed. And so Ealing's Public Spaces Protection Order stands. There is currently an application for permission to appeal to the Court of Appeal pending. We haven't heard whether it's going to go any further. And so that's what that case was about.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question which I think lawyers are frequently asked, and I don't know whether you have an answer to it. Lawyers are often, because lawyers operate in a predominantly male environment, certainly in the past, although I think this time, for the first time, there were more women than men entered onto the solicitor's role at the Law Society this year. So that's quite an important marker. But I'm going to ask you, do you think, as a woman, you were able to present the arguments in that particular case differently or more effectively than a man might have done?
So that's a difficult question to answer, because if one looks at where this started in terms of evidence gathering, that was at the local authority level. And many of the individuals involved at that level were men. And the important thing was that they got it. They understood what it was like as a service user to be confronted with this behaviour. And Paul Murphy's in the room today. He's a community safety team manager, and he led a lot of this process along with Councillor Binder Rai, who's also been part of organising today's event. But he understood the experiences of those women and went out of his way to understand that for himself in terms of the evidence gathering. And so as a man, he got it. And the judge, in his judgment, clearly got it. On the other hand, I think what I did bring to the process was that I had actually been into that clinic at supporting people who had to use the services of that clinic, and I had experienced what was going on. And the evidence was not just service users, but parents walking down the road saying that my child is asking me why there are plastic dolls on the floor, or why there's a bloody picture on the floor, and I'm being drawn into conversations I don't want to have. Or residents saying, I can see the impact these people are having, and I don't know whether to go and give the person a hug or go and give somebody a telling off. And I understood all of that. And I think what I did bring to the process is an understanding that I had to communicate to the judge that, yes, free speech is very important, and we live in a society where we should value and protect our ability to express our opinions, but there needs to be a line drawn, and here it was at the point of access to the services. And I think that's not really a point that had been drawn out in any of the evidence, but was something I was able to articulate, having been to the clinic, having looked at the evidence, and highlight some of the quite emotional evidence that we had. I don't know whether a man might have stuck to more of the legal arguments, but I did both. And it's difficult to say whether a man would have done it differently, but it was effective, and I think we managed to communicate it in a way that the judge understood and was clearly persuaded by.
Okay, thank you. Let me move on to a different topic, but still on the law. When I introduced you, I said it's important to listen to lawyers because lawyers have a role to play in helping to set the standards, which then everybody has to meet, because we apply the law, and you argue the law in front of judges to get them to decide what it means in a particular case. What role do you think, given that we have lots of law in place in terms of equality of pay and so on and so forth, and discrimination, what role do you think the law has to play in the future to tackle some of the topics that we've been raising?
I think there are two sides to it. And on the one hand, I think we set the standard for employers. And if we didn't have things like the Equal Pay Act, we would be in a much worse place. And so there is very definitely a role for legislation in terms of what's expected of employers in the workplace, within a landlord and tenant situation, all the different areas in which equality legislation might apply. So that's one side of it, and I think that's very definitely a role that legislation plays, and actually Parliament plays because they're the ones that create the legislation. Judges play because they implement the legislation in terms of their judgments. But the other side of it is, I think, it's Stella's point about empowerment, because I think it empowers employees to say, well, this is what is expected, and I expect you to put processes in place to either get to a point of equal pay or to deal with victimisation or discrimination. So I think the law plays a part in terms of empowering, whether it's women or whether it's a racial discrimination or some other form of discrimination, that it's about giving people the tools to say, hey, this isn't right. And so that's where I think the law plays a part.
Can I just bring Shauna in on that then, Shauna? Because one of the things you mentioned was was labour organisation. Now, certainly in this country, we have seen, I think this is probably a neutral way of putting it, far less union activity or unionisation of the workplace than we had in the past. There are still lots of unions, and they still do lots of good work. And that's not to say that they've disappeared entirely. But I just want to ask you about what you meant when you referred to organisation of labour, and what we should really be thinking of trying to create or resurrect in that field.
Certainly representative organizations. I mean, organizations that actually can give a collective voice. And again, there's a lot of evidence that the pay when you have a union, when you have a collective agreement, is higher. The conditions are better than when you're trying to bargain individually. Now, what we've also seen, though, is a lot of those collective agreements will exclude groups of women. So they'll be in areas where women don't predominate. So even when there were a lot of collective agreements and a lot of trade unions, a lot of trade union activity, it wasn't necessarily involving the women. So that's something else that has to be looked at. If you have bargaining groups, so you have to have this community of interest in a lot of countries, including my own in Canada. So they'll often define community of interest as those people who all look alike. So they're doing the same job. Yeah, so you'll see that in terms of collective bargaining as well. So that's, I think, something that needs to be looked at. Bargaining is also being pushed down to lower and lower levels globally. So, and the lower the level, so it needs, a lot of people will say it needs to be just at the enterprise level because that's where we really know what's going on. But if you push it up, sectoral or national, that's when you get some of the gender inequalities addressed more effectively. But I wondered if I could come in also on the equal pay issue.
Yes, of course.
And the legislation. Also, being a lawyer, I do believe that the law is absolutely essential in this area. It's not enough, but it is essential. You have to have those rights. What we've found with equal pay, however, is that just having a provision that you have equal pay for work of equal value doesn't get you very far. In some countries, it takes 25 years to get an equal pay claim finalized. So to get it up to the highest court and to actually get an award, that's a long time, and it's not going to be that helpful for most people. When all these claims are individual, it becomes very difficult. So if you shift the onus onto the employer, so you have to do wage mapping in some countries, you've got to do a wage assessment, and then you actually have to have a plan. If you've got a wage gap, you've got a plan, you have to have a plan looking forward in terms of how you'll address that. And that's been much more effective. So the law can address issues from many angles, and some can be more effective than others. And you probably need a number of different angles on different issues, like equal pay. And pay transparency is absolutely key in the law.
I want to sort of throw open the next question to anybody who has a view. We were hearing about the changing forms of work, the the changes in technology that we all anticipate that are coming in and that we're trying to get ready for as a society. How does the panel think the law needs to change to protect workers who are engaged in industries where that's going to be a feature?
If I maybe kick this off, I suspect the law can't protect. I think the only way that you're really going to set up a piece that works is to actually have a buy-in from employers that actually they need to do something to make the world work more effectively, because I've lost count of the number of laws I've seen enacted, initiatives I've seen put in, fantastic pieces of work about how things should change, and then nothing changes. Because not many people are going to want to take something through a court because of the cost, the personal strife that involves. So there's some sort of behavioural change that needs to happen on a more ground basis to ensure that things are different. I truly believe, if I look at a piece of research I saw recently from McKinsey management consultancy, very good management consultancy firm, they said in the profession I work in, which is accountancy, that accountants, 95% of our jobs will have gone in the next, maybe, say, decade, 95%. Interesting, the number of management consultant jobs that will go would be 7%. So you can be a little bit sceptical about some of the bias in the research. But what is happening is this huge sea change in some of the fundamental compliance, basic types of work. But there have been a groundswell of a huge number of jobs all around the world, and they're all going to be impacted. Different times, different levels, but they're all going to be impacted. And actually, it's how can you seize the opportunity to use that as a way to actually help people, both to get new skills, both to develop new ways of working, both to rise to that challenge. And that might actually play beautifully to people who want more agile working, but also may really, really push employers to actually act before the law acts for them. Because if you want to have a workforce that can manage that kind of environment, you have to put up a parameter and ability within your organisation to make that work. And the commercial impact will happen probably long before governments realise that legislation is needed. So I think this is a chance for people to actually make their organisations future fit. So I actually see this as an opportunity for everybody to create an environment that actually acts before they have to act.
But why should employers do it?
Can I just jump in on it? 'Cause I think one of the challenges with the law is the balance between rights of the individual and whether they have access to justice, and the responsibilities you're placing on employers and the penalties they perceive to be in place if they don't fulfil those obligations. So I think it's quite an interesting analogy when you look at data protection and GDPR regulations that are now coming into force, which actually have quite big sanctions in place if you don't meet your obligations as an organisation. And it kind of lifts the level of compliance. It makes people focus on it, it makes people act. And I think organisations are responding more responsively to that because the incentive is there and the stick is there. And I think what we lack sometimes is the incentive and the stick for the kind of gender equality and diversity agenda. We did a law review which we published in January, and we recommended a statutory duty to prevent discrimination and harassment, which organisations would be held account to. There'd be a code of practice and they would have to report on it. So it's a bit like gender pay gap reporting and going that bit further. But I think you've got to connect the requirement with the penalty that actually is going to hurt at the end of the day if you really want organisations to do it, because they won't do it just because they think it's the right thing to do. They'll do it also if they're afraid of what might happen if they don't.
I think that's a really good point, if I may say so. With the new modern slavery legislation that this country enacted, part of the structure, part of the framework is that large labour organisations, large companies have to do an audit, and they have to publish the audit to demonstrate that they have checked to see their supply chains and their own mechanisms to make sure that there aren't people who are subject to slavery and forced labour working in them. So that's a stick, and it's only for big companies, but it's a very definite stick that government's decided to impose, no doubt with a view to satisfying our international obligations, but also the call amongst the community for there to be something done in respect of big companies.
Could I give you an example of something
Yes.
that's been effective in our chambers? And that is that more and more local authority, we do a lot of local authority work in chambers, and often we have to apply to be on the panel. And so they put out a tender and we apply to be on that panel. And one of the bases upon which points are awarded to applications is diversity now. So they ask questions about how many BME staff do you have, and those sorts of things. And when we started looking at the answers to those questions, it was quite simply embarrassing. And it was very evident that we were a typical organisation in that the women and the ethnic minorities tended to be in the lowest paid jobs, so they might be our cleaners. But in terms of members of chambers, we weren't doing well enough. And that's not just our chambers, that's just across the bar. But the fact that the local authorities were asking that question made us start having the conversation. Because it was going to affect our individual pockets and our turnover. And it's only until you get that impact and that possibility of there being a penalty or a downturn in your bottom line that I think people start to make changes and start to have the conversations that will lead to organisational change. And that's certainly something we've seen in chambers. We now have a woman CEO. We've got women in senior positions on our staffing, and we've got more women and ethnic minorities within our membership. But it's only really because local authorities were asking questions that made us think about those things.
Right. So the public sector has a real role to play. Can I ask you then, Dr. Stiasny, what about London University? How is it tackling this type of push as opposed to rules and requirements being imposed upon it?
So one of the things we have is an audit of equal pay, and we are conducting that very seriously. And we have a program, or are about to start a program, Athena Swan, which is looking at how women can be advanced within the workplace. I do apologize for my voice disappearing. And we have a program for middle managers, which is the Aurora program, working with middle managers within the university to support them and develop them as they come forward to hopefully to look at new jobs, but also to be strengthened within the positions they're in.
And what are you seeing from those audits at the moment? Are you seeing the sort of picture that Shauna's describing?
I think we're seeing things that can be improved. We can see things that can be improved everywhere. I mean, I would say, if you look at higher education across the UK, only 29% of vice-chancellors in the UK are women. One of the other things we see across the UK, and I'm not sure, I suspect this applies in other countries as well, that is not a stable proportion. These proportions are actually very fragile. A woman is a vice-chancellor and then she leaves the job. It is highly, and one of the things we've watched in the country over the last 10, 15 years is that when a woman leaves, very often she's replaced by a man. We don't operate quotas currently. When a woman leaves that sort of position, she's replaced by a man, and the whole thing becomes really quite volatile and very fragile. So that concerns me for a more stable future. What is interesting is that in one university, the Vice-Chancellor there, a woman, has decided she wants to support quotas across the university. She's currently talking with her council to see if that can happen, but it is something that she is promoting very seriously, and has talked with universities right across the country. But the facts are currently there to be looked at and to be moved forward.
Well, one of the questions we're discussing this evening is about the role of universities in progressing gender equality in reality, as opposed to just what the law says, the bare minimum of the law. And if students who are going to go into business, running those companies, who are going to go into the professions, who are going to go into government, don't see women in those roles, then we're back where Stella was, saying that, you know, I don't belong there because there's nobody like me doing that job. There's quite a lot of churn, isn't there, we hear about in the academic world at the moment, with this widening of opportunities or massification. How are women faring in that, do you think?
I think some of the things that colleagues in the panel have talked about apply very strongly right across the sector. It's quite a major role for universities to have to change things and develop things. I think, you know, if you look across the whole education sector, I suspect that a lot of it starts far earlier and far more. I mean, when people were talking about the fact that students will be told that they are very pleasant when they're female, and they will be told they've done a good essay when they're male, that starts in primary school. That is common in primary schools. And we can't lose sight of that. We have to work throughout the education world in order to change things and build things up. And I've been sitting here thinking, I mean, this is slightly anecdotal, forgive me for this, but my children, who are now extraordinarily elderly, when they were tiny, were playing, my son and daughter were playing nurses and doctors. And I heard them say, you'd better be the doctor because you're the boy, you'd better be the nurse because you're the girl. We had never given them those ideas at home. We had talked quite strongly about the importance of women becoming doctors, and all our doctors in our general practice were women. They had never seen a male doctor. Where had they got that from? Had they got that from primary school? And I think another factor in all of this is the media and children's TV. If they see children's TV, media, books are very powerful influencers. So what I think I'm saying is, yes, universities have a role. Yes, we've got to do a lot, but we can't take all the responsibility. We've got to start earlier, we've got to start younger, and we have to build those strengths for girls and boys and across the diverse population in order to get to the point where actually we're growing on or building on very solid bases. I don't think those bases are strong. And I think that's what worries me in all of this. And I think that's why we have the fragile situations that I've described. So we might have 29% of vice-chancellors in the UK being women today. 25%, I believe, of the cabinet, the current cabinet, is female. 29% of vice-chancellors are female. How long will that last, and how quickly can that change and be reversed?
Black?
One, yeah.
You know, this is it. We can play with numbers, can't we? I wanted to come back to this point about the law, because I spent a lot of time in my career getting wheeled onto stages to talk about the Equalities Act. And what I saw was a lot of organisations spending huge amount of energy and time and staff resource into conducting these audits and box ticking, quite frankly, and putting their staff through the sheep dip of equalities training, and nothing changed. You may have the best will in the world, with the best will in the world, try to attract more women students, but if you don't look at childcare, if you don't look at the cost of going to university, then it doesn't matter whether you think you're complying with the law or not. You're not actually empowering people to access what you're offering. So I think we need to be very, very careful. There is the stick of the law, and I'm not in any way suggesting that isn't important, because compliance can be quite a powerful incentive. But if people are simply doing it so that they can tick a box to say we're meeting the letter of the law without actually doing anything to change the reality on the ground, then I'm afraid we need to find a different approach. And I still believe that the groundswell for change will come from beneath. It will come from students who are intelligent enough to see that these wonderful sounding equalities policies have made no impact whatsoever on the colour of the staff who are teaching them. It will come from students who see that despite, you know, nice sounding commitments to equality and to whatever else, the curriculum is still about old dead white men. If you'll excuse those of you who might identify with that.
They're the very quiet ones in the audience.
Very alive.
And, you know, I don't think anybody should say they haven't got a contribution to make, as long as they are alive, to making these changes. But please do not present us with yet another agenda which is about ticking boxes and sticking staff through sheep dips to say that they've had the equalities treatment. That is not making the change.
Absolutely.
I'd love to add to that because I really agree with you. There's something around an initiative, an exercise, a something, and it's very different when there's behavioural change. I mean, actually, do behavioural change one of the hardest things in the world because it means buy-in from the top, buy-in from everyone within the organisation and really living it and breathing it. What's more impactful is what you see than what you see written on a page. So if you watch people doing different things, if you see that behavioural shift, then you believe it, and it's so much more powerful. And the things that really will make a difference is not just seeing someone being put into a role for a particular reason, but them actually really changing the way that everything operates around it.
Well, let's
Can I add on something on that as
Of
well?
course.
I think it's an elaboration of what has just been said, because I really agree with that. I think there are 3 levels. There is the law, which is absolutely necessary, it's the stick. So that at least there's a framework, but that only gets you so far. Then you have incentives, which are very powerful because it goes back to putting your money where your mouth is. And we have a lot of research that suggests, particularly within organizations, I am less familiar with universities, but with organizations, that if you actually put objectives for people to comply, which are not the sticks, but they're more carrots, they will be more likely to comply. But that still doesn't get you to the next level, which I think is what you're talking about. It goes to the cultural change. And you can have sticks, you can have carrots, but if people don't actually believe and see that there is an actual change in everyday practice, in everyday activity, sometimes people say culture is what you do when nobody's looking. Right? So that's the kind of thing that is going to make a difference. And that's a much, much harder one. So the 3 levels do matter.
All right. Well, I think a really important part of life is to feel uncomfortable most of the time. And I think we should feel uncomfortable about this topic because plainly there's a long way to go. And as women alive now, this is the only opportunity we have to make a difference. So what I'm going to ask the panel to do, please, is to just share one thing that they have done as a woman in leadership, this sort of cultural change, this not something you had to do, but something you decided to contribute in your role. So who wants to go first?
Well, I've got a recent example that is a real-life example of my own chambers, where when I went on maternity leave with my first child, I've got 2, a 5-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old. At the time I went on maternity leave, there wasn't a Bar Council compliant maternity leave policy. And so I had to have some conversations to have that put right. And it was. And Bar Council is effectively our governing body and sets some guidance. It's not obligatory, there isn't a stick, but there's some guidance as to what the expectations are. But when I came back after my second child, what I realised that really what was missing was the ability to work part-time. Because in our chambers at that time, the contribution structure, the money we pay into chambers for the organisation to run, was based, was a fixed, the large portion of it was a fixed amount. So whether you earned £10 or £100, you were expected to pay the same amount. So if I wanted to work fewer hours in the early months after I returned, it made it very difficult. And so various conversations were had, and what we've achieved is what we call Scheme B. And there is an option to be able to go onto a percentage-based scheme if you want to work fewer hours. And it's not just for people, and it's not triggered by any particular need. So it's not just because you're returning from maternity leave. You can do it because you want to, you've got caring responsibilities, or you might just want to take your foot off the pedal or work on another project. There's no qualifying requirement. Anybody can opt to do it, which has been massive because both men and women have taken advantage of the scheme. And that conversation came about because of my own experience and the challenges I was facing wanting to work less hours than 7 hours a day, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, which is how I felt I was having to work in order to sustain a practice at the bar. And so that's been a real change that's made a difference both to men and women in chambers. And it's not something I did on my own. It was needed a buy-in from everybody, and various conversations took place, and there was a process. But there was a very positive outcome from that. And that's something I'm really proud of, and I think my chambers should be really proud of, is that we offer the fixed contribution scheme for those that want it. but there's an alternative for those that want to make other choices as far as their practice and other parts of their life are concerned.
Well, that's a great example. Anybody else?
I can say something. It's not as tangible, it's a bit more intangible, so to speak. So one of the things that I have found, because I've been around for a very long time, that, well, first of all, I am in a very privileged position, so everything has to be taken with a grain of salt, because we're talking about the kind of things that I might have experienced are micro problems, really in the bigger scheme of things. They're not huge. But I've experienced them very often as a waste of time. Basically, it's a waste of time. It's a tax on my time that my male colleagues did not have to incur, because I had to worry about things they didn't have to worry about. When people comment on your looks, or when people comment on, or they make sexist jokes, or all these little tiny things, they're a waste of time. So what I try to do now for my younger female colleagues is to try to take some of that tax out of them, and maybe try to take it for myself, if I can. So try to avoid them to have to waste their time with things that are not productive, and they are going to set them back, because at the end of the day, there's less time that they can devote to actually do the real work, right? And also emotional tasks. And one part of doing that is actually to make people uncomfortable. I used to not to want to make anybody uncomfortable. I've completely turned around that. I tell all these stories that I didn't tell before, because it's just not nice to say that this person said this to you or that person said that to you. I tell them all the time. So, but the interesting thing is that I realize, and maybe because I'm becoming older, I'm becoming more tolerant, that many of my male colleagues had no idea. They were in the same room as me, they experienced the same conversation, and they didn't even register. And that was just a revelation to me, the fact that you actually have to point it out, and then you do, and I am privileged because I work with people who are more or less enlightened. Then they notice, and then they realize. Not that a lot of things change, but at least now they notice. So the next time, they will not do it. But anyway, it's just, and I used to use numbers a lot, because I am a numbers person. I use the statistics. Statistics don't convince anybody. You have to tell them stories. So it's all about the stories. It's all about the stories. And the well-chosen stories sometimes are more powerful than the numbers. That's my experience, at least.
Stella?
I think that's a really difficult question. I'd like to think that my whole career has been, in some way or other, involved in empowering women and others to change institutions. But I think I'm reminded probably of a time when I was working in the margins in FE, which has its own advantages. We weren't quite as surveyed and managed as you might be if you were in the mainstream. And I'm talking about the mid-80s, when we set up what were the first courses in further education targeted at unemployed black people, at women who'd been confined to the home. We used to call it the houseworkers course. That ages it. And because the larger institution wasn't too bothered about what we got on with, as long as we kept our profile of students out of the main organisation, we were able to get away with a great deal, including setting up the first creche for women students in FE, and developing courses that really radically changed people's life expectancies. And what I mean by that is that women came to us at the beginning of the year saying, I want to learn to type, and they went out at the other end saying, I'm going to leave my husband and become a brain surgeon. That is the power of education. I've seen it. I know it. And I know that that is something to do with a holistic approach. It's not just about ticking a box. It's not even about saying, you know, aren't we great, we've got more black students this year than last, because it's not just about how many you've got, it's what's happening to them. And it's certainly, I believe, about having staff who reflect the population they're meant to be representing, and staff who have lived that life, so they can be genuine role models and genuinely encourage and empower students to change. Now, all of the stuff we've been talking about this evening, you know, impacts on that. There are no easy answers, but I think somewhere in that approach of working from the margins, empowering your students to make demands, and ensuring that your staff genuinely reflect who your student cohort is, are part of the solution.
Absolutely. Before I ask anyone else if they've got anything to share, I'll share one thing of my own. When I became quite senior as a barrister, I had the opportunity to choose who would work with me, which juniors I would have. And almost without exception, I would choose a woman, just because women just didn't get chosen that often. And because I was there, why not? I would choose them. They'd all be excellent, just as excellent as the men, no more excellent, no less. And the other thing I would do is I would always make them speak first. When we had conferences and meetings with police officers, CPS, security service, whoever we were working with, I would always get my junior female colleague to speak first. It makes a huge difference to speak first in a room. Everyone hears your voice. Nobody's surprised by it when you say something else later on. And so that was something that I brought in. Of course, it was terrifying for them, but actually it was really good for them as well. And they were never afraid of speaking first in the future. Just a little structural thing that actually made a bit of a difference. Anybody else got anything?
It's funny, isn't it? That, I mean, that just really resonates in the sense that sometimes it's things that on the face of it look small, but are hugely impactful. And I'd love to say mentoring and coaching were the most important things because they are huge. But funny enough, the thing that had made the most impact, one of the places I was working was around working from home. It was a particular team where presenteeism was a big deal, being seen to be there first thing in the morning and seen there being last thing at night. People used to leave their jackets on the back of their chair to pretend they were still there. And when you saw them the next day, you knew they'd just left it there. And it was a really destructive culture, actually for everybody, but it particularly impacted on the women in that organisation, quite a lot of whom had children or were caring in some other way. And so it just said, this is just ridiculous. And also, we all lived in London. You never know, the commute into London, hideous at the best of times. And so just said, well, everybody has to work at home 1 day a week. No exceptions, including the secretary that we had at the time. Everyone has to work at home 1 day a week. Doesn't matter if it's the same day, but we all must do it. And that means it doesn't differentiate, but also then you understand. So you know what it's like. So if you're working at home, you know the complications that involves. You also know the joy that it can give you. You can walk your dog, you can throw your washing on, you can do whatever it is you want to do, but it gives you flexibility. So we did it, and then we did it as a trial, we did it as a pilot, and after literally 2 days, I'd intended the pilot to be a month. After 2 days, everybody individually came in and said, this is genius, let's just keep doing this. And it just made everybody's life a little bit more relaxed, it made the balance a lot better. But more importantly, it didn't differentiate between people. So if you chose to work at home, and actually now there's full flexible working in that team, but if you chose to be the person who worked from home, you weren't stigmatized, but it did just open the doors and let the sun shine in, which I think is what work should be about, encouraging people to live a full life.
Excellent. All right, well, I want to not run out of time to talk about a really important area that Shauna raised for us, and that's care responsibilities balanced with work. It's a massive topic. People like me who have children and elderly parents and are caught in the middle, I think we're called the sandwich generation. These are real issues and they are a real challenge. So you mentioned something which you called the high road model, and it would need a lot of investment. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, it's really about making sure that you have those good care jobs. Long-term care is is where we see a huge deficit everywhere, and with the aging population, there is going to be much more need for elder care, and it's the women who are picking that up. So that's impacting on their work. So trying to get good services. We're also not going to be comfortable to put our children in childcare that we don't think is safe, or if we don't feel like it's good quality childcare, we're not going to do it. If we don't feel it's good quality elder care, we're not going to put our parents there either, or be comfortable with them being there. So it's trying to look at institutional approaches, but also redistributing within the household. Because it's the women who are doing that. Even when both the women are working, it's the women who are picking up those care responsibilities. So that redistribution has to come at many levels. There's also a role for the employer. And you talked about working from home. Now, try working from home when you have really young children. It's pretty difficult. But as they get older, it gets certainly much easier. And I remember wanting to work at home when my son was about 12. Now, he didn't need me to look after him every moment. He was at school most of the day. But he was happy to have me around. And one of the things that he said to me was, "Why can't you work at home?" He said that to me. Now, I worked at home from time to time on an ad hoc basis, and that worked well. But what I did do was I worked on Sundays at home. I used to go into the office on the weekend. It was a terrible schedule. But I didn't really need to. I mean, I had a lot of administrative things that I couldn't really do unless there was nobody around from the office. But my son and I agreed that I would do my homework at home on Sundays, and he would do his homework at home. And that actually worked really well. So we were together, we were, interacting, but we both had our things to do. So I think we also have a working system. We have that organizational culture of presenteeism, these other issues that are a construct. And if we can take that apart and we can actually design the working hours and the working arrangements in a different way, then I think that will help us with our care responsibilities.
So where's the money going to come from to make those caring jobs more valued?
We put a lot of money into infrastructure, so public works programs and things. There's some interesting research out there that shows if you put the same amount into care jobs, you actually would increase GDP. So there would be a knock-on effect in terms of the other jobs. So I'm not an economist, but the research is quite convincing. So a lot of that would actually be generated in the economy.
Okay. Sam, do you want to?
Just on this point about infrastructure, I think this is a really important point because we ought to be thinking about childcare and our care services as infrastructure. We ought to be investing in our care infrastructure, creating a care economy, which would pay the dividend that you've just referred to. But instead, we don't. We think of it as a private choice. We think of it as a service that families may or may not be able to afford to take advantage of. As a result, we have a very fragmented, fragile childcare system that is priced very highly for parents, but is actually poor quality and poorly paid for the staff. We're not treating it as an infrastructure item, but it's as much infrastructure as our roads and rail. We cannot function as a society. Our economy would collapse if we didn't get parents into work, if in all the carers that we're talking about, the women who are going to have to drop out of the labour market to care for older relatives, well, that's a massive cost. That cannot make sense. So we've got to flip our thinking over. Instead of thinking about how much will it cost to do it, well, what will we get the return on if we invest in these things and think of it as investment spend?
And it's hard not to escape the obvious picture of the road rail infrastructure, the building infrastructure, which is generally male-dominated in terms of people who are doing that hard physical labour, and the female-dominated labour in the home, whether it's for parents or children. So again, there's a gender, perhaps an assumption there, that if it's what men are building, it's of a particular quality and deserves investment. If it's what women are building, even if it's the men of the future as well as the women of the future, it doesn't deserve the same investment. Is that the sort of picture that we're seeing?
Well, in fact, if you look at the system of accounts, that infrastructure is seen as an investment. And looking at the services, those are costs. So on the balance sheet, they come up very, very different.
Now, last topic, we've got obviously got a limited amount of time. We know that these conversations are going to be happening across the world and other places. And I just wonder whether any of you have got some ideas about how those conversations, whether they're in Pakistan or Turkey or Czech Republic, how they might be different to the conversations that we've just been having.
Well, one thing that's come through from the annual survey we do is there's a huge disparity around the roles that women have in some parts of the world, in that there's far more opportunities or maybe engagement, or perhaps it's a cultural piece. But I was talking to one of my colleagues, fantastic colleague, in the Philippines, and we were talking about childcare. Interesting, I've got 3 kids, she's got 3 kids, we're having that conversation. And she went, so why is it a problem for you? And I went, oh my Lord, I can't begin to tell you, complicated. It's like running a military operation. And she just went, well, I just involved my family. And I think there's a really interesting cultural piece around how you have a sort of a community feel in some places that it doesn't solve everything, but there's something there around how do you, I think it is that infrastructure point, actually, is there is infrastructure in some places that's actually far better than there is in the UK around that particular issue.
Anyone else?
I think what I would like to say is that all around the world, the University of London students all around the world, where we see women, and we have 49-point-something% of our students around the world are women. Those women have a hunger for higher education. They have a hunger for work, and they have a hunger to stay there and to have a place in the future world. And I think that's one of the things that I'm sure will come through in the conversations around the world.
Anyone else? Stella?
Since my family's from Ghana, I've been thinking about that question in relation to the University of Legon, and I think it would be a very, very different discussion in a way. Childcare, as you rightly point out, wouldn't be such an issue because there are different structures for childcare in that particular society, but I do know that students are still busy photocopying books and pages from books simply so that they can have access to text. So I think the discussion would be a very different one. And then it's about, can we afford, I suppose, in the Ghanaian context, to be talking about the rights of women when we haven't actually sorted out the rights of everybody? You've got an education system that gets more and more expensive the further up the chain you go. So that those who've reached higher education are the fortunate few. And then you have huge issues and implications for students who stay in Ghana as opposed to travelling outside to get their education, and the value of that education, how it's seen. So I can't second guess the discussion, but I suspect it's going to be a very different one.
Okay, well, I have to draw things to a close as far as this panel conversation is concerned. One of the topics that I would have liked to have asked our panellists about is social media and how women's use of social media affects their effectiveness at university and their effectiveness in work, and how they tackle work, how they're seen in work. This is something that's particularly exercised me recently for some of the reading that I've been doing. But anyway, we can't deal with that. We can't deal with the many, many other things because it's such a big conversation, this one about gender equality in the workplace and in education. But just to summarise very briefly before I hand back to Dr. Stiasny, the first question was, why is it that we're not seeing the representative sample of women in leadership roles around the world? And the answer to that, I think, from our discussion is that it's to do with the value of the work that women do and the opportunities they get to rise to those leadership roles. And it's not just about pushing people to apply, because when they apply, they've got to be applying into a structure which facilitates them succeeding if they are the best person for that role. We've heard about the importance of feedback in a business context, and many other problems that we need to recognise are real. This idea that the gender pay gap improvement is stalling is something that I think should make all of us feel extremely concerned and uncomfortable. As Jane Eyre said, a field for women's efforts is absolutely vital to women's happiness. But what is a modern university's responsibility? Well, it must be, mustn't it, from what we've been hearing, to push women through, but also to model as a university, how the world should treat women, how the world should receive women and give them their place. Proper funding for education is absolutely vital in this country and as elsewhere. This expansion of opportunity has to be met by sufficient staff with sufficient security of tenure for them to be able to function properly and for there to be equality amongst the teaching staff. We haven't explored this question in any great depth, but we have touched on the expectation of the younger generation. As a mother of two university students and one A-level student, I know the younger generation have different ideas. They expect to be treated equally. They expect to have opportunities when they come into the world of work. And so as we've been discussing, it may well be that there'll be a push from them as well, and they won't be satisfied with what us women up here have had to be satisfied with. They may just simply not accept it. And as Shauna said at the very beginning during her talk, she said, the future is not preordained. We all have choices to make. I like a conversation where there's tension, where there's never quite enough time to say all the things you want to say, and there's lots of ideas bubbling up in your mind. And that's certainly what I found this evening, and I hope you have as well. Thank you very much.
So we've come to the end of this part of the evening, and a huge thank you to Mrs. Justice Cheema-Grubb for your summing up of tonight's conversation here in London. We here in London will take the issues raised tonight on board and develop 2 or more action points that will help us to further the agenda of equality for women. And of course, we hope that all the other conversations due to take place across the world will do the same. I'm sure you will agree with me, it's been a very interesting and enlightening conversation this evening, a very stimulating and challenging one, which I've personally felt was of a world-class standard. I would like to thank our keynote speaker, Shauna Olney, for starting the conversation, and of course the Honourable Mrs. Justice Cheema-Grubb for chairing the panel with such expertise, which we've been very lucky to draw on. And of course, I'd like to thank all our panelists for giving up their time to be here tonight and adding their own special dimension to our worldwide conversation. Their contributions have been invaluable. So thank you to Shauna Olney for her keynote lecture that set the tone for the worthwhile conversation tonight here in London, to Francesca Lagerberg, to Sam Smethers, to Kuljit Bhogal, to Stella Dadzie, and to Isabel Fernandez-Mateo. Once again, thank you, Mrs. Justice Cheema-Grubb, and I hope now you will all join us across in the Macmillan Hall, where you'll be able to continue the conversation over a drink. And I thank you all for coming.